Some prisoners escaped execution by mere minutes, saved by last-second phone calls or overturned rulings. Others survived their sentences entirely, only for new evidence to prove their innocence decades later. A few walked free, but their freedom came at a devastating cost. Yet for many, the nightmare never ends. Trapped on death row, waiting for a fate they may never escape, or surviving an execution only to die behind bars. Are they truly free, or still prisoners of a broken system? They cheated death, but did they ever find justice? Willie Francis crime, survived botched electrocution, convicted of murder. Willie Francis, at just 16 years old, became infamous in 1947 when he was sentenced to death for the murder of Andrew Thomas, a local pharmacist in St. Martinville, Louisiana. Despite his young age, Francis was found guilty of killing Thomas during a robbery, which was claimed to have gone wrong. However, many believed that Francis was coerced into confessing to the crime, and there was little physical evidence linking him to the murder. Francis's story took a haunting twist when he became the victim of one of the most chilling incidents in death row history. He was strapped into the electric chair for his execution, but the chair malfunctioned. The electrocution did not kill him as expected, and Francis was left writhing in agony, his body burned from the failed attempt. His reaction to the botched execution was one of both physical pain and confusion. He had just experienced a near-death moment that many felt was a clear sign of his innocence. The electrical chair's failure was not only a grotesque tragedy for Francis, but it also sparked national outrage. In 1948, despite the botched execution and public outcry, Francis was retried and found guilty again. This time, the execution was carried out successfully, and he was electrocuted at the age of 17. His final words before his second execution were reported to be, "I'm not afraid of dying." However, some advocates and legal experts believe that the botched execution might have been a symbol of Francis' innocence and a broken system that failed him. Willie Francis's story highlighted the injustices that plagued the criminal justice system, particularly the treatment of minors and those who faced flawed trials. His case was one of many that fueled the growing movement against the death penalty, demonstrating the irreversible consequences of errors in execution. While his crime and conviction remain controversial, the haunting image of a failed execution will forever remain one of the most shocking moments in death row history. Sonia "Sunny" Jacobs. Crime, wrongfully convicted of murdering 2 police officers in 1976. In 1976, a routine traffic stop in Florida turned deadly when 2 police officers were gunned down. The suspects? Jesse Taffero, his partner Sonia "Sunny" Jacobs, and their friend Walter Rhodes. Within days, the state had its suspects and, within months, Sunny Jacobs was sentenced to die, convicted largely on the word of Rhodes, who cut a plea deal to testify against them. What the jury didn't know was that Rhodes had fired the fatal shots, and his story had changed multiple times. Sunny was just 28 years old, a mother of 2, and had no prior criminal record. Her conviction was based on circumstantial evidence. She owned a gun, which had not been fired, and she was present during the incident. Despite no physical evidence linking her to the killings, she was sentenced to death, a sentence handed down in a legal system that ignored inconsistencies, suppressed evidence, and relied on the testimony of a self-serving accomplice. Sunny spent 5 years on Florida's death row, the only woman there at the time. She was kept in solitary confinement, often without sunlight or human contact. Eventually, Her death sentence was commuted to life in prison after her original conviction was overturned due to procedural errors. But her fight for justice didn't end there. After years of appeals, new legal representation, and the exposure of withheld evidence and unreliable testimony, Sunny was exonerated and released in 1992, having spent 17 years behind bars. Her case became one of the most high-profile examples of wrongful conviction in death penalty history. Tragically, her partner Jesse Taffero, who was also innocent, had already been executed in 1990, in a horrific botched electrocution where flames reportedly shot from his head. Sunny's reaction to freedom was nothing short of remarkable. Rather than being consumed by anger, she embraced peace. She took up yoga and meditation while in prison, tools she credits with helping her survive the trauma. Upon release, she dedicated her life to advocating for the wrongfully convicted and fighting against the death penalty. She later met and married Peter Pringle, a fellow ex-Sunonny from Ireland who spent 15 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. Together, they became a symbol of resilience and hope, telling their story around the world. Sunny Jacob's story is a powerful reminder that justice can fail, even fatally. She survived death row, but only just. Her story is not just one of legal error, but of personal transformation, strength, and unbreakable will. Richard Glossup crime, murder of a motel owner. Richard Glossup's case has drawn widespread attention, as it is one of the most prolonged death row battles in modern U.S. history. Glossup was convicted in 1997 of the murder of Barry Van Trees, a motel owner in Oklahoma. Glossup had been working as a supervisor at the motel when Justin Sneed, an employee, confessed to the murder. Sneed claimed that Glossup had hired him to kill Van Trees in exchange for money, though no physical evidence linked Glossup to the crime. Despite the lack of direct evidence, Glossup was convicted and sentenced to death. His conviction was largely based on Sneed's testimony, which many experts later claimed was unreliable, especially since Sneed later confessed to committing the murder on his own. Glossup's legal team has argued that he was wrongfully convicted based on a coerced confession and a deeply flawed investigation. Glossup's battle for justice has been nothing short of extraordinary. He has survived multiple execution dates, each time narrowly escaping death due to new legal developments, errors in the trial, and the emergence of new evidence. Most recently, the Oklahoma Attorney General admitted to serious flaws in Glossup's case, including mismanagement of evidence and the potential for a wrongful conviction. To this day, Richard Glossup remains on death row, awaiting justice. His case has garnered international attention as many people, including prominent celebrities and human rights activists, have called for his exoneration. Glossup's story is a striking example of how the legal system can fail the innocent, and how the pressure of being on death row can weigh on an individual for decades. Anthony Ray Hinton crime, 2 murders he didn't commit. Anthony Ray Hinton's case is a powerful testament to the devastating effects of mistaken identity and inadequate legal representation. In 1985, Hinton was wrongfully convicted for a string of murders in Birmingham, Alabama, after his photograph was misidentified as the suspect in a police lineup. The prosecution's case rested heavily on ballistic analysis, claiming that bullets found at the crime scenes matched a gun that Hinton supposedly owned. However, experts later revealed that the ballistics tests were flawed, and the analysis could not definitively link Hinton to the crimes. Hinton spent 30 years on death row for crimes he did not commit. During his time in prison, Hinton fought tirelessly for his innocence, enduring years of rejection from the courts and an unjust legal system that refused to listen. His case finally gained traction when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2014 that Hinton had been wrongfully convicted, as his trial attorneys had failed to provide him with an adequate defense, and the ballistics evidence used against him was dubious at best. In 2015, after being exonerated, Hinton was released from death row. His reaction to his newfound freedom was one of both relief and sorrow. He was finally free after decades of injustice, but the years spent behind bars had taken a tremendous toll on him. Despite the hardships, Hinton has become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, particularly in cases where innocent people are sentenced to death. He continues to speak out about the need for reform in the U.S. legal system and the risks of wrongful convictions. Hinton's case was a turning point in the fight against the death penalty and wrongful convictions, proving that even in the most dire situations, hope and perseverance can prevail. Henry McCullum and Leon Brown crime, rape and murder of 2 girls. Henry McCullum and Leon Brown, both intellectually disabled, were wrongfully convicted of the 1983 rape and murder of 2 young girls in Red Springs, North Carolina. The case against them was built largely on coerced confessions that were later determined to be false. Both men were young, vulnerable, and lacked the understanding necessary to comprehend the consequences of their confessions. Despite their pleas of innocence, they were sentenced to death. For over 30 years, McCullum and Brown remained on death row. Throughout this period, new evidence emerged that raised questions about their convictions. DNA evidence excluded them as the perpetrators of the crime, and in 2014, after years of legal battles, they were exonerated and released from prison. McCullum had spent 30 years behind bars, and Brown had spent 20 years. Their reactions to their exoneration were a mix of joy and disbelief, but also a recognition of the profound injustice they had suffered. McCullum was deeply affected by the years he had lost, but he and Brown both expressed a desire to make a difference for others who had been wrongfully convicted. The case sparked outrage over the use of coerced confessions, the treatment of intellectually disabled individuals in the justice system, and the problems with the death penalty. McCullum and Brown's release highlighted the potential for wrongful convictions in the death penalty system, and their story remains one of the most tragic and uplifting in recent memory. Damian Eckles crime, murders of 3 8-year-old boys, West Memphis 3 case. Damian Eckles, along with Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly, was convicted in 1994 of the brutal murders of 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. The case became infamous due to its reliance on dubious evidence, a coerced confession from Miskelly, and the fact that the 3 young men were targeted largely because they were outsiders and associated with the local satanic panic hysteria. They were sentenced to death, despite the lack of physical evidence linking them to the crime. Eckles, the youngest of the group, was placed on death row. His case, especially his treatment and conviction, sparked national and international outrage. He was subjected to years of solitary confinement, with the looming threat of execution constantly hanging over his head. The case, dubbed the West Memphis 3, garnered widespread attention, with numerous supporters, including celebrities like Johnny Depp and Eddie Vedder, advocating for the innocence of the 3 men. In 2011, after 18 years on death row, new DNA evidence surfaced, excluding Eckles, Baldwin, and Miskelly from the crime. The men entered an Alfred plea, maintaining their innocence while acknowledging the state's evidence against them. Eckles was released from prison in August 2011, his reaction a mixture of disbelief, anger, and overwhelming relief. His release was a monumental victory for the campaign to expose wrongful convictions, and Eckles quickly became an advocate for criminal justice reform. After his release, Eckles wrote a memoir, Life After Death, and he continues to work with organizations like the Innocence Project to fight for the exoneration of others wrongfully convicted. His case stands as a glaring example of the dangers of flawed investigations, media influence, and the use of the death penalty in cases with questionable evidence. Kirk Bledsworth crime, rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl. Kirk Bledsworth was convicted in 1985 for the brutal rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl, Dawn Hamilton, in Maryland. His case, like many others, was built on the testimony of witnesses and circumstantial evidence, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Bledsworth's conviction was primarily based on the victim's identification and a composite sketch, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence throughout the trial and his time on death row. In 1992, after serving nearly 9 years on death row, DNA testing became available and led to a breakthrough in Bledsworth's case. The DNA evidence revealed that he was not the perpetrator of the crime, and the true criminal was eventually identified. Bledsworth was exonerated in 1993 and released from prison. His case became the first in U.S. history where DNA evidence was used to exonerate a man who had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. Bledsworth's reaction to his exoneration was one of overwhelming relief, but also deep sorrow for the years lost and the damage done to his life. He became a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform and played a pivotal role in the passage of the Innocence Protection Act, which helped fund DNA testing for inmates. Bledsworth's story has been instrumental in raising awareness about the potential for wrongful convictions, especially in death penalty cases. Joseph Geratano crime, murder of a mother and daughter. Joseph Geratano was convicted in 1979 for the murder of a mother and daughter in Virginia. The case against him was based on a flawed investigation and what many believe was a coerced confession. Geratano had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and his confession was later revealed to have been coerced by law enforcement. His original trial was also marred by the failure to present important exculpatory evidence, and despite claims of innocence, Geratano was sentenced to death. Geratano spent 17 years on death row before new evidence surfaced that cast doubt on his conviction. In 1991, the Virginia Court of Appeals overturned his conviction, ruling that he had not received a fair trial, and Geratano was released from death row. His case raised significant questions about the fairness of the death penalty system and the importance of ensuring proper legal representation for those facing such severe sentences. Geratano's reaction to his release was a mix of joy and frustration. He had spent nearly 2 decades fighting for his freedom, and his case became an important catalyst for the movement to end the death penalty in Virginia. His exoneration also sparked greater attention to issues like coerced confessions and wrongful convictions, highlighting the flaws in the criminal justice system. After his release, Geratano became an advocate for justice reform, working with organizations like the Innocence Project to help other wrongfully convicted individuals. He continues to speak out about the need for change in the justice system and the dangers of the death penalty. Tommy Arthur crime, murder of Troy Wicker. Tommy Arthur was convicted of the 1982 murder of Troy Wicker in Alabama, a crime he consistently denied committing. The case against Arthur was based on circumstantial evidence and unreliable witness testimony, and throughout the years, numerous appeals and stays of execution kept him from facing death. Arthur's case became notorious for the number of times he narrowly escaped execution, with at least 7 separate execution dates being stayed due to new evidence, legal challenges, and doubts about his guilt. In 2017, after surviving multiple attempts to execute him, Arthur's fate was sealed when he was finally executed by lethal injection. Despite years of legal battles, his reaction to his execution was reportedly one of resignation. Arthur maintained his innocence throughout his time on death row, but his death raised questions about the integrity of the legal process and the risks of executing individuals with unclear or inconclusive evidence. Arthur's case became a focal point for debates about the death penalty, particularly in cases where there is doubt about the guilt of the individual. Advocates for his exoneration argued that his execution was a tragic example of the risks inherent in the death penalty system, and that justice had not been served. Clifford Williams' crime, murder of a woman in 1976. Clifford Williams was convicted of the 1976 murder of a woman named Juanita White in Florida. He spent over 4 decades on death row, despite his consistent claims of innocence. The case against him was largely based on eyewitness testimony that was later proven to be unreliable. Williams was convicted and sentenced to death, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. In 2019, after 43 years on death row, new DNA evidence came to light that exonerated Williams. The DNA evidence excluded him from the crime scene, and a key witness recanted their testimony, saying they had been pressured by law enforcement. Clifford Williams was released from prison at the age of 76, having spent nearly his entire life behind bars for a crime he did not commit. Williams' reaction to his exoneration was one of profound disbelief and joy. After spending more than 4 decades on death row, he was finally free, but he was also deeply affected by the years lost. His case became one of the most powerful examples of the potential for wrongful convictions and the consequences of a flawed legal system. Williams' release sparked renewed debates about the death penalty, particularly the risks of executing individuals based on unreliable or questionable evidence. His case also highlighted the need for greater oversight and accountability in the criminal justice system. Sabrina Butler crime, wrongfully convicted of killing her baby. Sabrina Butler was convicted in 1990 for the murder of her 3-month-old son, who died of blunt force trauma. She was sentenced to death based on a medical examiner's testimony that suggested the child's death was a homicide. Butler's conviction was rooted in a flawed forensic investigation and a coerced confession, which she later recanted. She was a young, struggling single mother at the time of her arrest and had no criminal history, yet was convicted largely due to the nature of the crime. In 1995, after spending nearly 5 years on death row, new evidence emerged that suggested the child's death could have been a result of a medical condition, not foul play. This evidence, combined with the fact that Butler had been coerced into confessing, led to the overturning of her conviction. In 1995, Butler became the first woman in the United States to be exonerated and released from death row after having her conviction overturned. Her reaction to her release was one of disbelief and relief, but the emotional toll of the years spent on death row remained with her. Sabrina Butler was finally free, but she had lost the precious years of her life and the memory of her child that would haunt her forever. She has since become an advocate for the wrongfully convicted and for reforming the criminal justice system, particularly regarding the treatment of women and minorities in the system. Butler's case is a heartbreaking example of how systemic flaws, wrongful confessions, and biased forensic testimony can result in the destruction of lives. Her fight for justice has shed light on the need for comprehensive legal reform and greater attention to the rights of those on death row. Juan Melendez crime, convicted of the 1984 murder of a store clerk. Juan Melendez was wrongfully convicted of the 1984 murder of a store clerk, a crime he did not commit. His conviction was largely based on faulty eyewitness testimony, which was later disproven. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking Melendez to the crime and the failure to investigate other potential suspects, he was sentenced to death in 1984. Melendez spent 17 years on death row in Florida, consistently proclaiming his innocence throughout the process. In 2002, after years of legal battles, new evidence came to light, including a tape-recorded confession from another man who had previously been a suspect. This confession, along with the absence of any physical evidence linking Melendez to the crime, led to his exoneration and release from prison after nearly 2 decades. His case became a powerful example of how the criminal justice system can fail, particularly when eyewitness testimony and inadequate legal representation are involved. Melendez's reaction to his release was one of overwhelming emotion. After spending 17 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, his exoneration came as a bittersweet victory. He had lost nearly 2 decades of his life, and although he was free, the psychological scars of his wrongful conviction remained. Juan Melendez went on to become an advocate for the abolition of the death penalty and criminal justice reform. His story highlights the need for greater scrutiny of eyewitness testimony and the critical importance of DNA testing in ensuring justice. Curtis McCarti crime, convicted of the 1982 murder of a woman. Curtis McCarti was convicted in 1982 for the murder of a woman named Vicki Gunnels in Oklahoma. McCarti was sentenced to death based on faulty forensic evidence and a weak case that was built largely on unreliable witness testimony. After his conviction, it was revealed that police had mishandled evidence and that critical forensic evidence had been ignored or mishandled, leading to the eventual revelation that McCarti was likely innocent. McCarti spent 21 years on death row before his case was revisited due to the emerging possibility of evidence tampering and misconduct by law enforcement. In 2007, DNA testing revealed that McCarti was not the perpetrator of the crime, and the forensic evidence that had initially been used to convict him was discredited. McCarti was released from death row after spending more than 2 decades on death row for a crime he did not commit. McCarti's reaction to his release was one of deep sadness and disbelief. Although he was free, the years lost on death row weighed heavily on him. Curtis McCarti's exoneration sparked outrage over the conduct of the police officers involved in the case and led to further calls for the reform of the criminal justice system to ensure that others would not face a similar fate. McCarti has since become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, particularly for those who are wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. His case highlights the importance of maintaining integrity within law enforcement and the need for rigorous oversight in criminal investigations. Nicholas Yeris crime, convicted of the 1981 rape and murder of a woman. Nicholas Yeris was wrongfully convicted in 1982 for the rape and murder of a woman named Linda May May. He spent more than 22 years on death row before new DNA evidence was discovered, proving his innocence. Yeris was sentenced to death despite the fact that no physical evidence linked him to the crime and there was a lack of eyewitness testimony. His conviction was primarily based on a false confession which was coerced during an intense interrogation. In 2004, DNA evidence finally exonerated Yeris and revealed that he had been wrongfully convicted. He was released after serving more than 2 decades on death row for a crime he did not commit. His case became a pivotal moment in the fight against the death penalty, as it demonstrated the flaws and injustices of a system that could execute innocent people. Yeris' reaction to his exoneration was a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had spent over 2 decades fighting to prove his innocence, and the years of psychological trauma from being wrongfully imprisoned weighed heavily on him. Yeris went on to write a memoir, 7 Days to Live, about his experience on death row, which has been praised for its candid portrayal of the emotional and psychological toll of wrongful conviction. Yeris is now a public advocate for criminal justice reform, specifically focusing on the injustices of the death penalty and the importance of DNA testing in ensuring that innocent people are not executed. Alfred Dwayne Brown crime, murder of a police officer in 2003. Alfred Dwayne Brown was convicted of the 2003 murder of a Houston police officer, and his case became a significant example of the pitfalls of the death penalty. Brown was sentenced to death after a controversial trial that relied on a mistaken eyewitness identification and failed to disclose crucial exculpatory evidence. His conviction was heavily contested, and after spending 12 years on death row, new evidence came to light that suggested he was innocent. In 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals vacated Brown's conviction, after discovering that prosecutors had failed to provide a key piece of evidence that could have exonerated him. This evidence, which included an alibi from a witness who had been overlooked during the trial, was enough to prove Brown's innocence. Alfred Dwayne Brown was released after more than a decade on death row, and his reaction was one of gratitude but also sorrow for the years lost. He was exonerated but had missed much of his life, including his daughter's entire childhood. Brown's case brought attention to the problems of prosecutorial misconduct and the dangers of relying on dubious eyewitness testimony. After his release, Brown received a $2 million settlement from the state of Texas for his wrongful conviction. He has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform, focusing on wrongful convictions and the failures of the death penalty system. Glenn Ford crime, convicted of the 1983 murder of a Shreveport man. Glenn Ford's case is one of the most tragic examples of a wrongful conviction in U.S. history. Ford was convicted in 1984 for the murder of Isidore Roseman, a Shreveport, Louisiana, man who was active in the civil rights movement. Ford's conviction was largely based on weak evidence, and it was later revealed that the prosecution had failed to disclose exculpatory evidence that would have pointed to Ford's innocence. Ford spent nearly 30 years on death row before new evidence, along with the revelation that his defense attorney had failed to present critical evidence, led to his exoneration in 2014. Ford's conviction was vacated, and he was released from prison after spending nearly 3 decades awaiting execution for a crime he did not commit. Ford's reaction to his exoneration was understandably complex. He was released from prison at the age of 64, having spent the prime of his life on death row. Tragically, just 1 year after his release, Ford died of lung cancer in 2015. He spent his final months battling cancer, which he had contracted during his years on death row. Ford's case became a symbol of the failures of the criminal justice system, particularly in how the system handles capital punishment. Ford's tragic death highlighted the reality of life after death row. Even after being exonerated, he was unable to escape the physical and psychological toll of his wrongful conviction. His case brought widespread attention to the issue of prosecutorial misconduct, the lack of oversight in death penalty cases, and the desperate need for reform in the criminal justice system. Ford's story remains a sobering reminder of how systemic failures can lead to irreversible damage, even for the innocent. Joe Damrosio crime, convicted of the 1988 murder of a woman. Joe Damrosio was wrongfully convicted in 1989 for the murder of a woman named Rosie Kenny. Damrosio was sentenced to death based on unreliable witness testimony and a coerced confession, but no physical evidence linked him to the crime. His conviction relied heavily on a highly questionable lineup identification, and there was no forensic evidence connecting him to the murder. After spending over 20 years on death row, Damrosio's case was re-examined, and evidence that had been suppressed during his trial came to light. In 2012, after years of legal battles, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that Damrosio had been wrongfully convicted, and he was released from death row. The key to his exoneration came from new DNA evidence and the revelation that key exculpatory evidence had been deliberately withheld by prosecutors. Damrosio's reaction to his release was one of deep emotion and disbelief. He had spent more than 2 decades fighting to prove his innocence, and the realization that he had been wrongfully convicted was overwhelming. His case is a powerful example of the consequences of prosecutorial misconduct and the importance of a fair trial. Following his release, Damrosio became a vocal critic of the death penalty and an advocate for criminal justice reform. He dedicated much of his time to speaking out against wrongful convictions and the systemic issues within the criminal justice system that allowed for such errors. Damrosio's story exemplifies the potential for life-altering consequences when evidence is manipulated or ignored by authorities. Nathan Fields crime, convicted of a 1984 double murder. Nathan Fields was wrongfully convicted in 1986 for the 1984 murders of 2 men in Chicago. Fields spent 18 years on death row before new evidence came to light, revealing that he had been framed for the murders by corrupt Chicago police officers. Fields' conviction was based on testimony that was later discredited, and his case became a symbol of police misconduct and the flaws of the justice system. Fields' exoneration came in 2009, after a long legal battle and the discovery of evidence that proved his innocence. In the years following his release, Fields became an outspoken advocate for justice reform. He fought to bring attention to the systemic issues in the criminal justice system that led to his wrongful conviction and the need for accountability for those who manipulate the system. The case of Nathan Fields is particularly powerful because it highlights not only the flaws in the judicial system but also the role that law enforcement corruption can play in framing innocent individuals. Fields' release and subsequent activism have been crucial in raising awareness about the prevalence of wrongful convictions, especially in cases where the police are involved in misconduct. Sharif Cousin crime, convicted of the 1995 murder of a man during a robbery. Sharif Cousin was convicted in 1995 at the age of 16 for the murder of a man named Raymond Harris, which occurred during a robbery. Cousin was sentenced to death, but his case became controversial when it was revealed that critical evidence had been overlooked during the trial. Additionally, an alibi video surfaced that proved Cousin was not at the scene of the crime when the murder occurred. This new evidence led to a re-evaluation of the case and eventually to Cousin's exoneration. After spending 4 years on death row, Sharif Cousin was released in 1999. His case became widely publicized due to his youth at the time of the crime and his eventual exoneration. Cousin's wrongful conviction and subsequent release highlighted issues surrounding the juvenile justice system and the vulnerabilities of young people in the criminal justice system. After his release, Sharif Cousin focused on advocating for criminal justice reform, particularly concerning juvenile offenders. He has worked to raise awareness about the wrongful convictions of minors and the importance of ensuring fair trials and adequate legal representation for young defendants. His story remains a compelling reminder of the need for reform in how the justice system treats minors, especially in cases involving serious charges. John Thompson crime, convicted of a 1984 double murder. John Thompson was wrongfully convicted of a 1984 double murder and spent 18 years on death row. His conviction was based on faulty evidence and suppressed exculpatory information that would have proven his innocence. Thompson was scheduled to be executed, but his legal team discovered new evidence, including a piece of crucial evidence that had been withheld by the prosecution, which led to his exoneration. Thompson's case is one of the most notable in the debate over the death penalty because it underscores the dangers of prosecutorial misconduct. After spending almost 2 decades on death row, he was released in 2003 when his innocence was confirmed. Following his release, Thompson fought for compensation and advocated for the reform of the criminal justice system, especially focusing on issues of prosecutorial misconduct. Thompson's experience was particularly harrowing because his case revealed the depth of injustice that can occur in death penalty cases. His exoneration and the years lost on death row became a powerful catalyst for discussions surrounding the ethics of the death penalty and the need for judicial accountability. Thompson was awarded a $14 million settlement, but he expressed that no amount of money could ever truly compensate for the time lost and the pain endured. Thompson's case remains a cautionary tale for those who support the death penalty and serves as a reminder of how critical it is to ensure that all evidence is presented fairly and without bias. The stories of these individuals reveal the dark side of a flawed justice system, where the innocent pay the price for mistakes that can never be undone. Some escaped execution, others were exonerated, but the scars remain. As we reflect on their battles, one question lingers: how many more could be saved if we learned from these mistakes? Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime documentaries. In our next episode, we'll be diving into the stories of those executed this month, along with part 2 of those who narrowly escaped death. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the chilling truths behind death row.